Okay, this is part of our CISSP supplement, and this is Understanding Cybersecurity Frameworks, Part 1. All right, Part Uno. All right, so as we're talking about cybersecurity frameworks, we're going to get into the what do they mean? And we're basically going to go into the fact of how do you unwrap these? What do they actually, what does it mean, right? And because of my third grade education and what I struggle with as far as just common sense things, I had to break this down to a point where I could actually understand it. Because I kept hearing all these security folks talking, you talk about a framework. Do you have a framework? I have a framework. We have a framework. Everybody has a framework. Frameworks are important. And I'm like, what the heck is a framework? So to me, it's like I'm going to build a building and maybe build a hog confinement. So from Iowa, I can have some pigs in there. That's a frame, and I got to build a frame around it, and I got to work to do it. So there you go. Yeah, building a hog confinement. That's a framework. No, that's not true. Okay, so what's the purpose of a framework? Well, it is a guidepost, okay? It's a guidepost to guide you where you need to go. No, it's a guidepost to secure your environment. The whole purpose of it is that you need to look at how do you secure your environment. Okay, so if you don't know what to do, so let's just say you are Billy Bob, and Billy Bob has no idea what to deal with around security. He knows the terms, basically, and he knows that he should do some stuff, but he doesn't really know what he should do beyond that. And so therefore, how do I do it? Well, that's where the frameworks come into play. And they're really useful, especially when you're dealing with frameworks that are more simple, but they can also have some that are more complex. ISO 27001 is an example of that, which will just basically make your eyes bleed. So the point of it is that you will need to have a framework, especially if you're putting some level of security within your organization. It's also designed to meet some level of compliance requirements. As an example, there was a recent law that's been passed. I think it was in Alabama or South Carolina. Well, South Carolina had one for sure. And the fact of it is that you didn't have to have, it was for insurance agencies. And these insurance agencies have had a certain amount of people, and I think we've talked about on the podcast, a certain amount of people within your organization, so basically a certain size, or you have a certain number of clients. You must follow some strict criteria. And of these criteria, one of them is to have a security program in place. And what they say is that if you follow a security framework for this, then therefore that will help meet the overall goal of the law. So the frameworks are just help to guide people in the right direction and what to do. However, if you're a person that's not a security person, you're going to read this stuff and go, what in the world are they saying? And I'm a security person, and sometimes I scratch my head going, I have no idea what you're saying. It's because, again, third grade education does get in the way just a little bit. So those are some of the things around the frameworks. As an example, and there's many use cases, but the New York Department of Financial Services, NYDFS, they have some high regulations around financial institutions by the state of New York. And therefore, one of those is that you must have some level of security in place following a framework to do so. So this is how they do it. Massachusetts 201 CMR 17.00. Okay, that just came out recently, and that hit the streets, I think, last week. But basically comes right down to is that if you have anybody that's a Massachusetts resident and you get a breach within your organization, there are some certain things you have to do. One is the fact that you got to give credit freezes to people, you got to give credit monitoring to people, so, the standard fare around that. But bottom line, you got to do that. Now, but you also have to have the ability they have to have a written security program in place. And the way I read it, it sounds like you just, as long as you're working in that direction, you're okay, but it's still a little fuzzy to me. Bottom line is that they want you to have some documented, written information security program that you need to follow. Well, frameworks are a great way to do that, and therefore it kind of points you in the right direction. So that's a framework. Rough idea. Not a hog confinement, but a framework in cybersecurity. Okay, so what are some available frameworks for you to play with? There's really about the big five, I call them. There's way more than just five, obviously, but there are some that a majority of the people utilize these frameworks. And the first one is PCI-DSS. This is the payment card industry's data security standards. And it's part of the PCI SCC or CCSS, something like that. But bottom line is that's the payment card. Credit card stuff goes through PCI. ISO 27001, this is defined by the International Organization for Standardization. And therefore you follow that standardization for organization standardization. You follow that, and that works out really well from a global standpoint to be able to follow this framework. They are different. So the PCI-DSS is different than ISO 27001, and it's different than some of the NIST frameworks that are out there. Just a couple that I have sitting out is the 853, which is around security and privacy controls for federal information systems and organizations. And then there's the 800-171, protected, controlled, unclassified information in non-federal systems and organizations. Yeah, it's a lot to say. And then finally, the one that actually I think has got the most meat behind it. I mean, they all do, but I mean, the one that I feel is probably the easiest to be adopted by many is the Cybersecurity Framework. They typically call it the Charlie Sierra Foxtrot. Okay, and in that you have they fall in line, but it used to come out of the Critical Infrastructure Framework, and if you can follow that, and it does, it's got some really good pieces in there to help you with your organization to walk you through what you should do to best protect your data. So those are some of the key frameworks right there. There's 3 of them. We'll get into the next one here. High Trust is the Health Information Trust Alliance. And I talk about this in the CISSP course that I put out there. But High Trust, COBIT, control objectives for information and related technologies. So those are the big 5 in that place. And they're all really important to do. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll into one as a use case, and then you can kind of see how that plays out. So the use case one I have is PCI Standards, payment card industry standards that are set up, PCI-DSS. I should just say PCI Security Standards. Now, there's technical and operational requirements that you have to put in place, and this is managed by the PCI Security Standards Council. And so what it comes down to is you have to have a firewall. You have to have operational ways to manage the firewall. You have to have a way to manage your change of management of change, so forth. So there's different types of PCI standards that are available. One is the PCI PTS. Okay, that's for manufacturers. Now, from a flying standpoint, I'm going to go back to my days when I say PTS. It's just like, whoa, it's like that the Wayback Machine that just flips you back, and you're going, oh yeah, I remember a much better time in my life. No, it is the practical test standards by the FAA. So when you flew airplanes, you had to do a practical test standards. Well, that's not where PCI is. This is a different animal, but that's for manufacturers. There's a PCI PA-DSS, and that's the software development aspect around PCI development. So how do you manage your credit cards, and what kind of the software development around your credit cards? That is all the PCI PA-DSS. However, there is a change to that that's coming, and we will get into that in just a minute. Then there's the PCI DSS, which is for your merchants and service providers. This is the typical one that you get for anybody from, I don't know, your Olive Garden, your restaurants, your gas stations, your daycares, you name it. They all have that. If they take a credit card, they all have to fall under the PCI DSS. Now, there's some key components. Now, these are just a few that I'm throwing out there of the DSS. Again, we talked about technical and operational pieces of this, but they have firewall configurations. So you need to know how to configure your firewalls, or you need to pay someone to do it for you. And they do give you some guidance around how you should protect those and what are some key things you should configure your firewall for. There also are people out there that are certified in PCI, assessors, and so forth, and they can give you some guidance around that as well. You need to avoid vendor default passwords. That's a given, right? So if you get a machine and it's got a password and its default is quote-unquote password, they don't want that. You don't want passwords from somebody else, because guess what? What I used to do in a previous life is we would then Google. This is before Google was really cool. We would Google what are the standard manuals for, let's just say, some Linksys router. Well, it tells me right in there what is the standard username and password to get into this Linksys router. Well, great, I already know it, so now I'm good. So those same default vendor passwords are everywhere, and if they're default, guess they're on the internet. Everybody has availability to them, so you want to avoid those at all costs. Now, you also want to encrypt your transmissions of data. Any data that's transmitted, you want to make sure it's encrypted. Protecting the stored cold hard. Now, this is the other part that I thought was interesting. Protect stored cold cardholder data. They don't say how you should. So you got the first one says encrypt transmissions of data. Second one says, quote unquote, protect stored cardholder data. What the heck does that mean? Well, I think there's some interpretation there, right? So how are you protecting it? Well, I've got a username and password to get into the system that holds that data. Okay, so you're protecting it, right? But the username and password, the password is password or monkey or something like that. Yeah, that's not really that effective. So the key question around that is there's many components to the PCI that you can definitely get into. And I highly recommend looking on YouTube for some options around that, but also get yourself a professional to help you if that is your livelihood. So around compliance aspects, now there are tools available from the credit card companies to help you ensure that you meet compliance around PCI. They got scan tools, they got all kinds of stuff that are available to you to use, because the credit card companies, they don't want you to basically give up your ghost on these cards. They want to keep the cards, right? It costs them a lot of money when they have to go reissue new cards. They have to cancel accounts. They have to blah, 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 blah. All that stuff is a pain in the patootie for them. So therefore, they don't want to deal with it. So therefore, they provide some tools for you as the merchant to help you with that. Now, from a qualified assessor standpoint, there are different assessors, or there's different capabilities within the PCI that help you evaluate the capability. There's qualified security assessors. Okay, these are approved to validate the adherence to the PCI-DSS. So it's basically like an auditor, right? They come in, they audit you to make sure you're meeting the requirements based on what the PCI-DSS states. There's also approved scanning vendors. So if you have an external facing website, you have to have your website scanned. And they don't want you just going out to Billy Bob Scanning Market and doing it. They want you to have an approved scanning vendor that you go through to do the scanning of your websites. So again, that's all your internet facing stuff. Now, PCI-SecurityStandard.org has a lot of reference materials you can refer and reference back to help you with securing your site. But again, those are some key places to kind of consider, PCI-SecurityStandard.org, and you have your assessors and your scanning vendors. Now, there's a self-assessment questionnaire, and we're going to kind of get into that here in a minute. Before I do that, the network configuration piece of this is also, you need to understand that you need to do this. Now, you can self-help it. You can do it yourself, but it's probably not the best option. So if there's any sort of configuration that needs to occur, you probably need to pay someone to help you with it. And the reason I say that is because it potentially increases your liability in the event something goes sideways. You should outsource it. Find reputable parties. You need to understand the regulation around PCI, though. You can't just say, hey, Bill, you're a PCI certified dude. Go do it for me. And Bill goes, sure, I'll do it. Well, then Bill misses something, and next thing you know, you're getting sued. And in the case of the credit card companies, if you don't take it seriously, they just turn off your ability to use a credit card. Well, in today's world, if you don't have a credit card reader of some kind, that is bad. That makes you're going out of business, baby. So something to consider around that. Now, the self-assessment questionnaire, there's some various questionnaires that PCI puts together for you, the PCI-SecurityStandards.org, to help you with this. And the first one is a self-assessment questionnaire A. Now, it says, didn't mean to yawn on you. So what it says is card not present merchants and all cardholder data are outsourced. So what does that mean? That means that everything is outsourced. You don't have to, they don't keep anything, and you have a third party that does it. So when it comes to the information, nothing's staying resident within your system. But you still need to follow the SAQ-A. Even if the credit cards aren't stored on your system, you need to follow it. A good example would be WordPress, maybe, or a website that you may have, and you use an iframe that will then take the data and ship it off for you. Technically, with an iframe, you don't have to have the full-up PCI evaluation. You can go to an abbreviated version like the SAQ-A because the credit card is never resident within your system. It's migrated off to the payment card company. So again, we talked about SAQ. Is cards not present, merchants, all that data, all that stuff's outsourced. SAQ-B is basically imprint only merchants, no electronic card holder. So that's the old style where you got a card down and you go crunk, crunk, you back and forth. And if you're probably younger than 30, you're going, I have no idea what he just said. But bottom line is you have a carbon copy, they copy your credit card, they charge it, and then what ends up happening is they send it into the credit card company. If you're a merchant, it's a good way for you to get taken because what ends up happening is you run the card and then there's no money. The guy's gone, so it's good that you use electronic. So if you can use it, I'd recommend it. Now, the SAQ-CVT, merchants using only web-based virtual terminals, no electronic storage. Okay, so if you're using a web-based virtual terminal of some kind, then that one will fall into you. SAQ-D is all other merchants not including in the description for SAQ A through C, and then all service providers. So if you're a service provider, you got to do it. If you're SAQ-A through C, you got to do it, or you do not have to do it. But it's basically that's the full thing you got to go through. The whole shoot and caboodle is what in that there. Now, there's templates and checklists to go through this on addressing these capabilities, and I would recommend that you go online and see what you can find to help you with it. I was just looking at the site, and they have a whole laundry list of things that you can go through and check in the box on that. Now, the only downside of that is you're going to have to understand the technical terms behind it, because if you don't understand it, it's just basically kind of useless. So make sure that whoever does the configuration for you, you understand and they understand what's needed. All right, so that's the references I've got for this broadcast/podcast, and what we've got is it's IT governance has got some great stuff out there. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework, Cali picks security, Tenables trends around security frameworks, adoption surveys, PCI security standards, and interactive application security testing. Now that was part 1, part uno. We're going to have part 2 will be coming up here next week. We'll have that aspect added to it as well. The reason I did that, I broke it up, is because if not, the podcast would be about an hour and a half long, and all I know is my ADD lasts about 5.2 seconds, and if I go longer than that, then everybody's leaving. Well, if I add both together, yeah, we'll have a whole lot of people gone. So we're breaking them into 2. You'll like it. It'll be awesome, but we'll just do it very similar as we have today. All right. Thanks so much for joining me here at Reduce Cyber Risk. We greatly appreciate it. Hope everything goes well for you, and catch us on the flip side. See ya.